Agile Uprising podcast. Hello and welcome. We're here with the next installation of the Agile Manifesto review done by the Agile Uprising podcast. Today, I'm your host, Ryan Lockard. I'm joined by James Gifford from the Agile Uprising, and we are very happy today to be welcoming on Brian Marick. Brian, how are you doing today?
Oh, pretty well.
Thanks for joining us. Brian was one of the original Agile Manifesto authors from Snowbird in 2001, so we're just looking to do a review and understand his story, bring that out forward to the people. I guess for starters, Brian, for those that aren't familiar, what was your professional background leading up to 2001, getting invited to Snowbird? And I guess as you're rounding off that story, what was your introduction point? Who reached out? How'd they reach out? And all that good stuff to get you a seat at the table, sir.
Okay, so like most people involved in the Agile Manifesto, I'm old, which means I graduated from University of Illinois in 1981. I went to work for a local startup, which was involved in networking and such like things, modifying the Unix kernel. So I was a C programmer for about the next 10 years. The most notable thing I did was in the early 80s was the first or second, I can't remember, big AI boom, which became an excuse for lots of different people to implement Common Lisp on various different architectures. So I was the lead for a project to basically to port Common Lisp to a now obscure and defunct brand of what were then called super mini computers, which is obscure and defunct partly because they spent money porting Common Lisp to super mini computers that were used in flight simulators where, in fact, people didn't want Common Lisp. They wanted Fortran. So I was basically a C programmer. I had a certain amount of interest in testing and gradually moved over into concentrating on testing, basically testing the Unix kernel, lots of stress and load type testing for what was one of the earlier attempts at a symmetric multiprocessing Unix kernel, also lost to the mists of history. So I was doing that for a while. As a part of that, I produced a C code coverage tool that was created by hacking on the GNU C compiler, and it had the usual types of coverage, but some other interesting types of coverage that we had invented to help us with our load testing. And then I conceived of the brilliant idea that I would quit my job, go independent, open source the coverage tool, and make a living with companies paying me to add things to the coverage tool. So as a newly married person with a wife who was a veterinary medicine intern making something like $11,000 a year, my first year of business became, I made $500. That's gross, not net.
American dollars.
American dollars, yes. Right. And at the time, that was worth just immense amounts of money in 2016 dollars. So I got used to talking to my mother-in-law, who would say in a concerned tone of voice, "How's business?" Well, what there is of it, which is none, is great. So after a while, this became pretty clearly a losing strategy. But I was open source before open source was cool, before it was actually even coined as a phrase, though, of course, free software was a thing back then. So what I did then I started doing training, developing courses in software testing with a special emphasis on programmer testing. There was no particular notion of TDD at that time. However, this was the day. Another thing lost in the mist of history was that in the early 80s, the Japanese auto industry was eating our lunch at car manufacturing. And it was the general business wisdom that they were going to eat our lunch in everything, including in software, which, as you may have noticed, didn't actually happen. But it was the general wisdom of the time. So what that meant was people were trying to adapt Japanese, mainly Toyota, business practices to software, which meant, among other things, finding errors at the point of production rather than at the end of the line, which meant there was a big management push for programmer testing. And so I made my living doing programmer testing without making, as it turns out, much of an appreciable difference in anybody's practice, because programmers at that time didn't want to do testing and only did testing because their managers were forcing them to, because we hadn't, or Kent Beck and Warren Cunningham hadn't yet discovered or made public the secret sauce of not only doing your testing before you write the code, which was not unknown at the time, but what was missing was the really rapid write one test, write a little bit of code, write one test, write a little bit of code, refactor. That cycle hadn't been invented or discovered yet. And as a result, that turns out to be enormously psychologically important. We didn't know about it then. So testing remained unpopular despite my courses. Then came the World Wide Web. The World Wide Web shifted the balance of power from management to programmers, because all of a sudden, people who had walked onto the Stanford campus and entered the computer science department could then leave and get $90,000 a year working for startups in Silicon Valley. $90,000, again, being real money back then. Mm-hmm. So the programmers stopped doing developer testing. Management couldn't force them to do developer testing. So I shifted into end of the line, end user testing, so-called black box testing. And at that point, I came under the influence of Kem Kainer, who had written a book on software testing. And he and James Bach and Brett Petticourt and I sort of got together and we schemed and produced something that was called the Context-Driven School of Software Testing, which was, in testing terms, a reaction against planning and top-down that was very parallel to the reaction that people like Kent Beck and Bob Martin were having to top-down requirements, specification, implementation, testing style, software methodology that was the way to do things at the time. So we were a parallel movement of troublemakers, avant-garde people. It happened at the time. I was also, for much of that time, a graduate student of Ralph Johnson's, Professor Johnson at the U of I, who was one of the people who wrote the first Patterns book. Mm-hmm. And I was part of his reading group. And as such, we read pre-publication drafts of things like Martin Fowler's books. So I got to know, or Martin Fowler got to know of me through that. He was a one of the, not one of the instigators, I believe, but one of the people who was going to the Snowbird conference. He knew I was doing testing. He knew of this parallel sort of testing. He knew there were no testers in this group. So he got them to invite me and James Bach as representatives from the testing community. And James didn't go and I did. And that's how I ended up at Snowbird. So I was not really one of the inner group.
Cool. Yeah, I'm sitting here jotting down a million questions, but we've made some traction, so I'm going to skip over most of them. Actually, there is one blanket question. So back when you were doing some of that early project work and moving over the flight simulation code to the supercomputers, what size were the project teams you were working on? Were they were they the traditional thinking 20, or were they small?
The project, so I was a team leader of a project. It had 6 people on it. The Common Lisp project had 3 to 4 programmers on it. Mm-hmm. So they were small teams.
That's awesome. And then I know that the title or the label test-driven development, or TDD, that came into common usage after Snowbird, correct? Or was that
that's actually...
Sorry.
It became... No, well... It's hard to say. They're roughly contemporaneous. It was called test-driven development at first. Design got replaced later as being a better name. I think I remember I argued with Ron Jeffries on the C2 wiki. Might have been after Snowbird, might have been before, but I wouldn't say it came after. At most, it was at the same time.
And I can't imagine Ron Jeffries arguing.
Well, actually, since the XP Explained came out before Snowbird, and it had TDD in it, TDD came first.
Okay, cool. Okay, so your introduction to the group was by way of Martin, it sounds. And
yeah, I think so.
So the event itself, you get the invite and you agree to go. You fly into beautiful Snowbird, which I understand was the second option after a Caribbean island. So obviously you guys chose the...
I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. It's one thing that we learned as we went through this exercise of meeting with you guys. Yeah.
Anguilla.
Yeah, thank you. Anguilla was the other one, or Anguilla, however you say it. But Snow won. So as you were preparing to go, obviously you mentioned the wiki. There was some of you guys were contemporaries by way of the phone calls that led up to it, maybe through some of the conferences and the meetings that happened leading up to Snowbird itself. Of the 17 or of the other 16, how many would you say you knew at least by name or voice versus those that were completely unknown? Like just, oh, hey, you're so-and-so.
Well, let's see. I knew Jeffries, or knew of Jeffries, Kent Beck, Ward Cunningham, Bob Martin, Fowler. That's could well be it. So a minority.
Yeah. So when you first walk into, I believe the story that I have is that it was the 2 days that were planned, but everybody kind of met up the night before the first day and just did the cursory, hey, hello, handshake type thing. Do you recall that?
Not at all.
Okay, cool. So then your earliest memory of the event itself, what do you, when I think of it, if I were there, because obviously I was not, but as I think of it, I imagine it'd be a whole bunch of alpha type personalities, some really intelligent guys in the room, all vying for their opportunity to talk about what it is they were interested in, be it XP, be it the Scrum guys, be it the length of iterations or level of documentation, all of the things that we now take for granted. I'm curious, was that what you experienced, or what do you remember as you first walked in the room and everything started going?
Well, I'd characterize it pretty much exactly the same way as you did. In fact, I did characterize it that way. There's a play, also a movie called Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and there's a character called Big Daddy in it. And one of his catchphrases is, there's a powerful odor of mendacity in this room. And for whatever reason, my wife and I had latched onto it and changed it into there's a powerful odor of testosterone in this room, because she's a large animal veterinarian. She's a professor at the University of Illinois, and she became one at a time when there were not very many women large animal veterinarians. So she had to deal with a lot of hyper aggressive men, and so we had that catchphrase. And so I called her up that evening and I said to her, there's a powerful odor of testosterone in this room. And there was a lot of alpha male jockeying. And I had pretty much decided that the whole thing was going to be a catastrophe, but there was snowshoeing. So I believe the setup was work in the morning, break in the afternoon, work in the evening. And so I figured, hey, I get to go snowshoeing in the afternoon, so at least I'll get something out of this.
It's a nice compromise. So as things were getting going, the story that I think I've heard enough times that I believe it's mostly true and mostly accurate. Everybody starts talking, and quickly it was realized that we need some sort of harness or some sort of barriers around these conversations, or else it will be an utter waste of time. And somebody brought the idea, and I think it's been presented as Martin's idea, to take out some index cards and everybody write down something that they wanted to talk about or something they were passionate about and put that in a pile. Then you all went through an affinity mapping exercise where you said, this is like that, this is like that, and that is like this, and all of that good work. Does that seem to sound familiar?
I do remember a card storming exercise. I don't have any clear recollection of what came of that.
Mm-hmm.
It gave people something to talk about, but I don't remember any aha moments from that.
Do you happen to have a memory of, and even if you don't have an exact memory, thinking back, what would you have done? I mean, what would you have written on your card before your first card, or the item that you were most passionate about before tossing it?
Well, as a representative of context-driven testing, I would probably have written down some of the things that were important to context-driven testing. One of the most important things that seem to be missing from Agile is the notion of exploratory testing. And exploratory testing is extremely compatible with TDD in the sense that it is explicitly cast as both a doing work of finding bugs while simultaneously using your experience in the moment to modify your plans of where you're going, which is very like TDD. And in fact, very like a lot of creative endeavors in a lot of different fields that have similarities to that, which you might call the Agile style. So I don't remember what I put down, but it probably included that.
At the risk of going down a rabbit hole, What I just heard you saying about exploratory testing is interesting, and I just want to check myself on something. TDD, you write your test up front, right? And then you code against those tests. Do you see exploratory testing as a complement to the upfront test, or is exploratory testing something you do after you already have some code written, or even at the very end once all the code is written?
So, generally speaking, so I should say that in the early years of 2000 and such, I was Mr. Agile testing guy. But in fact, I sort of, gave the robe and scepter and all of that to other people who had a lot more continuing direct experience than I do. Notably, Lisa Crispin and Janet Gregory, who wrote the Agile Testing book, and Elizabeth Hendrickson, who is also involved in context-driven testing and is an Agile simpatico person who spent a lot of time thinking and doing exploratory testing in the context of an Agile project. So I pretty much defer to what they have to say over what I have to say. But generally speaking, in 2003, I don't want to say invented, because it's really, of all the things I've done, it's kind of one of the least significant, but has had probably the greatest impact, which was the so-called Marick test matrix. At the time, there was a distinction made between customer testing, that was from the first XP book, and TDD. There was that distinction was floating around in the air. There was a distinction between doing something as part of support of the programming team and doing something to evaluate the product. And those two ideas were floating around, and I just crossed those two axes. And so said there are 4 quadrants of testing. One is about supporting the team. One side is supporting the team. One side is evaluating the product. What I did at that time was I assigned exploratory testing to one of those quadrants. That is, it is evaluating something that someone thinks is a finished product in business-facing terms, as opposed to TDD, which tends to be an internal terminology. And so that's pretty much where I put exploratory testing. That's a little bit artificial, because anything where you divide the universe into 2x2 arrays is artificial, but it tends to be
a solid framework to start from.
Yeah, and exploratory testing tends to be something where I was strongly influenced in the 80s by a guy named Robert Glass, who did a study of he worked for Boeing. He did a study of bugs that came back in fielded products, avionics software, and he discovered that the majority of the bugs were what he described as code not complex enough for the problem. Essentially, cases that were missing if statements, which are also called faults of omission. And those are cases where the programmer did everything they were supposed to do, but didn't know something that they were supposed to do, and so didn't do it. And exploratory testing is the thing that looks for those kinds of problems. Gotcha. Whereas TDD is a much more constructive building. It's it's not that clear cut, but if you had to make a binary distinction, there's the distinction between helping you construct something and discovering you've constructed the wrong thing.
Yeah. I love going down the TDD and the quality rabbit hole all the time, and I'm afraid that I would send us deep down that path if I keep on asking questions here. But I'll bring us back into 2001. So again, the card sorting exercise happens. I believe somehow that forms a living agenda that is then iterated upon as you guys continue the conversations. I love the story of the four statements, right? The this over that, the double positive statements that you guys emerged with that became the most well-known aspect of the manifesto itself. What do you recall of the exercise that led to that, the distillation of all of those ideas into such long-standing four statements that have really never been changed or challenged?
Well, so this is where, as I'm guessing you've probably noticed before, there's a certain Rashomon or everybody remembers the story differently effect.
Yes, sir. That's a very, very true statement.
So this is what I remember, and it is honestly what I remember. I have no certainty that it's what happened. I remember the meeting appearing to be disaster. I remember two people getting disgusted and disappearing during a break, and coming back with essentially, very close to the final form of the Agile Manifesto statements. And I think that the picture that's in the background of the, dead white males gathered around looking at something, I think was looking at the writing that they had written and discussing that and not making many changes to it. Now, the problem with this story is that at one point, a few years ago, I was talking about this, and I said to Martin Fowler that I remember you were one of the two people, but I don't remember who the other person was. And Martin said to me, I wasn't one of the two people, but I remember there were two people who did that, or something like that. So there you have it. I wanted to give him all the credit, but apparently he doesn't think he did it, and I don't know who did, if anybody. Maybe you have found the mysterious two saviors.
Well, the good news, I've whittled it down to 2 of 17, so that's the good news. Okay. You hit the nail square on the head. I mean, I've heard different versions of this to the point where no matter what anyone tells me, we've spoken to 8 or 9 of you, of the authors so far, and no matter what anybody tells me, unless they have video or audio, it's one of those magical things that will never actually be known. All we know is what that outcome was, and that outcome is really important. And I love the idea that this over that, the double positive. It's
very clever.
Yeah, it's a great way, and I think I generally ask a question about, was that done to handle compromise? And I think usually, I'll ask you actually, do you feel that this over that was a tool to handle compromise and to sidestep arguments, or was it used for another reason?
Well, since as far as I know, it was those two people who wrote it in that form. I'd have to defer to them, whoever they are, on why it existed. I don't have the sense that it was a device to deal with tensions in the group, because I don't think there were fundamental, factual, what is Agile about tensions, really. I thought of it as a very clever marketing tool. It's to deflect. It makes a good tool to deflect criticism after the fact. Somebody says, but what about this? Well, we like that, but we like this thing that you don't talk about a lot more, so let's talk about this. So really the document is in a lot of ways is a marketing document, a very well done marketing document supported by an extremely clever marketing campaign due to Ward Cunningham, which was putting it up and giving people the option to sign on to it. Mm-hmm. Those two things were pretty critical, I think, in making known ideas into popular ideas.
Well, I think one thing that also helped, this movement got traction damn near immediately. As soon as it went out the door, I feel like it wasn't a slow burn, it was just explosion. But I believe one of the more effective tools to make it gain so much traction was the label Agile. And, I'm familiar with the fact the original meeting in Snowbird was labeled the Lightweight Methodology Conference, right? And almost immediately, it's been said enough times, nobody really liked lightweight methodologies. Like, that's not a tight enough branding of what this was. And there is also the use of lightweight, which I guess drew some consternation. And I've heard stories also about the exercise that you guys went through to actually allow Agile to emerge as the label. Do you remember those discussions? And do you remember if you had any individual contributions to that conversation?
I remember there was such a discussion. I don't remember very much about it. It seemed like once Agile hit the board, it was a fairly clear winner. But that's all I remember.
Okay, cool.
I've got a couple minutes.
All right. Cool. So then a typical question that I like asking, and I think you've already answered it, but there were the intentional breaks, which are good for multiple reasons. Every good conference, you need time to comprehend, to unpack, and to compartmentalize your thoughts about what you just consumed and where you want to go next with the conversation. So you guys build in those mental hygiene periods by breaking the day into session, break, session. You mentioned snowshoeing. Was the three activities that I heard were most popular were skiing, hanging out in the lounge, and hot tub. You were a snowshoer. Do you remember filling your time with any of the other three or something else? And that's the first time someone said snowshoeing. So
I was the only person who went snowshoeing, it's a ski resort. But they did have snowshoes there. And I can snowshoe, but I can't ski. So I was the only snowshoer. I remember a hot tub, and that's essentially all I remember. I was since I was something of an outsider, I didn't know all these people in person. And since I'm not a hugely gregarious person, I mainly took the breaks as a way to get off by myself.
Nice. And excuse my ignorance, but is snowshoeing basically, everything I know about snowshoeing I learned from Bugs Bunny. Is it basically walking in the snow through the woods?
Yes. Okay. It is walking on things that keep you from sinking more than about 4 or 5 inches. Now, it happens that this is a very steep mountain, so it also involves a lot of essentially climbing. And the snowshoes they had were not great for climbing type snowshoes. They didn't have good crampons and such, but it's involves more exertion than walking through the woods. Makes it sound like.
Well, I have no context, and I'm lying. It's Bugs Bunny and Bear Grylls. I've seen him make snowshoes out of things as well.
It's good for people who are too clumsy to ski.
Gotcha. I should try that next.
And people who it allows you to feel super smug on the way up, because the cross-country skiers are doing this weird cross-country skiing thing, and then super unhappy on the way down as they go zipping past you.
Love it. All right, so let's bring it back into the Snowbird. Is there anything from Snowbird that you remember that we haven't touched on that you see as poignant, or anything that is generally not well understood from the event itself, or is it pretty well documented as far as you remember?
An interesting part from my point of view was after we finished the values part, there was discussion around what came to be the second page, the principles part of it, and the form, the hook for it, right? The values page has a couple of good hooks.
Mm-hmm.
I used to be a technical editor, and in the process got fairly attuned to how important it is for an article to have a hook that draws you in and propels the piece. And the manifesto proper, the values, has the notion of values, which sort of comes from the XP book, but is an unusual way to start talking about software development in terms of values. And it has the this over that format. So on the second day, there was a fair amount of discussion about something more concrete than values, which came to be called principles, and what the hook for that would be. And it was, generally speaking, somewhat unsuccessful. And I decided that I really wanted this second page to happen. So I took it on myself to do that, but the meeting was essentially over then. Mm. And so the rest of it was done by email and wiki. And it was a really interesting example, to my mind, of how much more difficult remote collaboration is than face-to-face collaboration. Because while the principles turned out okay, I think it's obvious that they're not anywhere near as compelling as the other one, and as the first page, and they're not nearly so tight.
Yeah.
And if you look at the one of the things that griped me as well as an editor at times and as an English major in college is like there's no consistency in the different parts. And one of them is even grammatically incorrect. And because it was so cumbersome to get wording changes that had to be agreed to by everyone, we ended up with a less satisfactory end product than we could have. And that was, I don't know that I'd call it an epiphany, but it really made me think, wow, this in-face stuff is important.
Yeah. Do you, speaking specifically to there's 12 principles, I believe. Do you recall, and I remember it seems to be another general theme, is that the one that had the most discussion, or do you remember one of the principles that had a significant amount of discussion that was not equally distributed to the other 11?
Yeah, and when you say it, I'll know which one it is. So say it, and I'll say, yeah, it was that one.
I'm gonna probably not get it verbatim, but the the delivering working software in a few weeks to a few months with a preference for the former.
Yeah, there was a lot of discussion about that.
A lot of I heard there's a lot of heat going back and forth, specifically between one person and a small group of people. So, but I don't know the names. That's the interesting thing. I keep hearing there was a strong debate, and somebody was digging in, saying there's no way you can do it in a few weeks, and somebody else is saying there's no way you should be doing it in a few months.
I don't remember any particular heat around that, but I remember discussion.
Yeah. Now, looking back at the manifesto in whole, is there anything that you, other than refinement and wordsmithing and maybe tightening up the principles, is there anything that you wish would have made it in there now in retrospect? Something that you, with a little bit more seasoning, would have pushed stronger for inclusion in?
I'm not sure that I would say one of that is necessarily an addition. One thing that's griped me for a good while is that there's the individuals and interactions over processes and tools. They're an interesting characteristic of the people, most of the people at the Agile Manifesto meeting, is that, as Pete McBreen put it sometime after that, the Agile methods are methodologies made by people who like to program. And in particular, I think the really important influence of small talk and the way it led into the patterns movement and the way the patterns movement led into Agile is probably underappreciated. And what we've seen, so in one way you could really mischaracterize what Agile was about was you had these techies who approached the social world and did some interesting things with group organization, the marshaling together of people's productive power. And we have seen since then that an English author called C.P. Snow wrote something about the two cultures, which he divided what you might call the STEM culture, science and technology, from the literary culture of the time. Nowadays, we would say hard sciences versus humanities. Or you'd say traditional programmer versus the people who naturally gravitate, people. What we've seen in Agile is we saw for a time where those two cultures came together, and now they've pretty much split apart again. You see this in the Agile conferences, for example, where the programmers don't go to the Agile conferences anymore. They're now basically the people who are good with people have, speaking as one who is not, the people who are good with people have regained the ascendancy that Agile for a time took for them. And to a certain extent, that phrase in the manifesto, individuals and interactions over processes and tools, has too often been used as a club by people who don't care about any tool invented since the talking stick, as used in sequencing meetings, which is from the original colonization of this continent or before. And I think some amount of damage has been done by that, because it caused us to downplay tools, and it caused a separation that I wish had been avoided, the separation between two groups of people.
That's a really interesting perspective, and not to bring in my own perspective here, but you notice I say that now, I'm about to do it anyway. Mm-hmm. What I've actually been sitting on, and I don't know what the right word is. I'm going to go with frustrated, but that's not the word I want to use. What I've been frustrated with is Agile and Scrum, in particularly, are becoming more about project management and brand than it is about the mindset of delivering high quality code to solve actual user problems. Mm-hmm. And it's just, I am using the word frustrated, I guess. It frustrates me because we are losing the craft. And I'm curious, from your perspective, when you say that we're separating the people from the programmers, I completely see it. I agree with everything you said there. Where do you see the programmers finding community? And is it Stack Overflow? Is it GitHub? Or where do you see that that conversation's not happening? It's just not happening at the conference space where I believe it has value. It just seems to be cordoned off into its own space. And I'm curious where you see that space at.
Well, to some extent, the whole software craftsmanship thing was created to address that, if not to heal the rift, but to give the programmers something to rally around. I can't say that I've noticed that's had a ton of oomph. It's not had the impact, I think. What I've noticed is, so I spent a lot of time associated with the Ruby world, and I think to the extent that things are happening, it's happening under the guise of the language and tool communities. So Ruby conferences are pretty obviously Agile inflected. And the same is true. It's very interesting to look at language communities as the mechanisms for spreading these ideas or resisting these ideas. I spent a number of years working in Clojure, mm-hmm. and to some degree, where Ruby was a language that was heavily influenced by Agile, Clojure is to some extent, and some of the other functional languages are to some extent anti-Agile. Not anti-Agile is the wrong way to put it, but there is pushback, especially around the iterative notion, that's so most obvious in TDD.
I'm sorry, you're talking about the larger being you're talking about like Java, .NET, like some of those bigger languages? Are you talking about in mass?
So I'm not very familiar with the Java world. I'm familiar, the language communities that I have really any familiarity with, Ruby, Clojure. I was fairly heavily involved in Clojure. I've drifted away from Clojure. I'm now looking I'm now working in Elixir and Elm, and language communities of a smaller size, and especially the language communities that are associated with a benevolent dictator, which all of those sort of are, they develop a particular personality, which is human beings being the kind of apes that they are heavily influenced by the personality of the benevolent dictator. So in Ruby, there was the saying, "We are nice because Mats is nice." The benevolent dictator had a really strong influence. And I think that in the language, I think it's the language communities that are the place where the encouragement of the craft or whatever is really going on.
Gotcha.
Not a clear way to put that, but if you Ruby, for example, especially more so the non-Rails part of Ruby, but Ruby has a feel to it that is similar to the feel of a working Agile team. Even if the working Agile team is working in Java or something, there's a sort of tacit understanding of how such teams work, and that same sort of thing seems to appear now associated with language communities. So if you're looking for the place to go that advances the spirit of Agile, it's probably more likely to be a language community than some sort of generic "we are software craftsmen" community. Maybe.
Yeah. No, I agree. And I think I never thought of it that way, but that actually does make a lot of sense. And I think I agree with that. Some of the smaller regional conferences too, I think that while not language specific, they are technical focused. I think you get a little bit more of the technical contribution there, like the programmer, the developer, the tester buy-in in the smaller ones, because they're not heavily commercialized. You actually have technical tracks that are technical. We have a few of those. I'm based in Philly. We have a few of those in the Philly mid-Atlantic type region, and you do get
ETE.
Perfect. Yep, ETE is a great one.
I spoke there once, and that was I was giving this typically woolly talk about Agile and Foucault and crazy stuff, and next door was somebody giving an introduction to Scala.
Yeah, perfect. That was actually the one that was in the front of my mind as I was talking there. But there are a few others, and I think the developers are getting smart to the fact that a lot of these conferences are just marketing ploys, and they're going to spend their time where it's valued most.
And things may also be different in Europe. I think, for example, the XP conference in Europe, which is maybe the longest running Agile conference. I think they just did 16. Has a much healthier mix, perhaps.
It's interesting. We already spoke with Ari. I wish I would have had this context or this thought in my head before we spoke with him, because he's active in the European conference circuit. I would have liked to have heard from him. Maybe I'll ping him after. But I guess we already are full foot in the door of where we usually wrap these conversations, and that is, what are you hoping for emerging Agilists or for that next generation that's coming into this space? If you could make one wish or one hope or just one challenge to that group to improve that original Agile mindset, what would that be?
So let me try and get this in some semblance. of order. One thing, it does seem to me, you could probably be a better judge of this, but a lot of the old guard agilists to have to some extent sort of dropped out. Like I've dropped out around 2007 to 2009. And I think a lot of people have dropped out. I dropped out and decided I want to just be a programmer. And that's what I'm doing essentially with the rest of my life, is being a programmer, doing.
Yeah, but sorry, if I don't ask this question, I'll have deeper. What happened in 2007 to 2009 that there had to have been some tipping point, I would assume.
There was. I was participating in a bank, a large Midwestern bank that was rolling out Scrum. And one of those things where they call someone up and say, I need a whole bunch of consultants. And then somewhere along the line, who was just an independent, got dragged in. Now one of my formative experiences in Agile had been with Lisa Crispin's team in Denver, where I'd gone, it was probably 2001, and Mike Cohn was sort of their, I think, CTO / Agile expert. And I talked to a bunch of those people, and especially to their product owner at some length. And I distinctly remember her and generally everyone saying, oh man, this is the greatest thing ever. It's a lot of work. That's what the product owner, I distinctly remember saying, it's a lot of work, but I can't imagine why anyone would ever do a project ever again. And of course, I was like, yeah, this is great, because I'm a big fan of joy at work. And these people had it. And at this bank, I was talking to one of the programmers, and he said, and this is, I'm pretty sure, an exact quote, at least my job doesn't suck as much as it used to. And that was the tipping point, because I'd gone from this is the greatest thing ever to my role in life is making people's jobs suck somewhat less. And that was pretty much when I decided to pack it in, though it took some time to actually do it. But so to the old beaten down people like me, there was to some extent a goal in Agile. Something Kent Beck has said is that all of XP is writing down just what Kent Beck does not what Ward Cunningham does naturally. And there's a particular style of working that particular types of people like me like to work in. And Agile has been successful enough that people like me can find places that they like to work in and work in the way they like to work, which is an accomplishment. It's not quite changing the world as much as one might like, but that is sort of where I have settled.
So the Agile train keeps moving.
The Agile train keeps moving. What I would like to, where I would like to see Agile move forward is in a couple of things. One is remote work. So when I dropped out of the Agile world, I had been programming, doing open source software for a long time, and I liked the experience. One thing that I've craved ever since I was the maintainer of GNU Emacs on the Gould Power Node system of computers, was the observation, was seeing software get progressively better and cleaner over time. There was a particular file in GNU Emacs called unexec.c that was really important for porting, and you saw that get better and better and better over time. And that was considered impossible in the day. So I've had 2 jobs, like real jobs, as a programmer, and the second job was a fully remote team, and where we did remote pairing and remote meetings and remote everything. And I just absolutely hated it. It seems to be missing. It's not necessarily a bad decision from a business point of view, because it lets you cast your net for programmers a lot wider, but it was not nearly as pleasant or productive an experience as I want to have from working in an agile team. And given that I want someone to figure out how to make remote work more closely approximate what's possible with co-located face-to-face work, because I really crave the latter, and there's not a good body of knowledge of how to do that. So that's one improvement I would like to see.
And that's something that, ultimately we when we are, when we do a lot of engagements, and, Ryan has some district, all Ryan's folks are local, but I work with a lot of distributed teams, and it really was horrible through the 2010, 2011 timeframe. But it goes back to tools. It all comes back to tools and the technology. I still do software development with friends all over the world. I have a friend down in Brazil, and we still get together and we use a conferencing system, sort of like Zoom. And we have the Brady Bunch camera up, and we all have a third monitor that's literally dedicated to the Brady Bunch. Mm-hmm. And that's how we, because we can sit there and talk and pull shades down when we need private chats and things like that. So some of the video conferencing has gotten better, and it makes it feel more homey, like you're actually sitting there with people. But it is nice to get, I do often miss that, hey, let's get together, go grab a coffee. Those are the pieces, that human aspect that you miss. Like, you can solve some of this with technology. So, you are right. Distributed software development is something that needs to be fixed, and it will be probably, in the upcoming future. It's just going to take a little bit more time.
One of the things that I noticed on this last job, working remotely, was I had not realized how bad I am at reading faces and how much I depend on reading posture and stance. And that's one of the things that is hard to do with remote pairing, because if I'm sitting next to someone or sitting across from someone, which is how I like pairing, I can perceive, not see exactly, but I can perceive when they're tensing up. I can't really see that from faces. Another thing that I've realized when I was doing that is how much of my thinking is involved in movement. And how much of the way that I participate in design meetings around blackboards is based on sort of a kinesthetic sense of where people are and what their position is based on how they are. And that's going to be tough to do with little monitors, like we're looking at right now. And that does sort of tie in to this a second thing I'd like to see Agile work on, which is to put it like, I always knew I was weird. I never knew I was weird for a programmer. And I think that there is a tendency in Agile projects to select, and I think this is something that people complain about software a lot in general. There's a tendency to select for cultural fit, which leads to a homogeneity that is maybe not so good. Sally Ann Freudenberg, who's out of the UK, who is autistic to some degree, has been giving lectures and talks and such about incorporating neurodiversity in teams. And I think there's probably an untapped potential for making an explicit goal not to figure out how to make everybody emotionally the same or stylistically the same, but to build a team that's, a team of rivals, like President Lincoln had, or a team of people who are different but can somehow figure out how to work together more productively because their differences compensate and build on each other rather than everybody being the same and not building on each other.
I actually am a fan of hiring based on culture. The idea is not to build a uniform culture. It's to hire. It all depends on how you define that word, right? And for me, the definition is, first of all, people that are willing to work in a trust-based culture. If you're looking for a set of instructions to follow and to code against spec, then that's just somebody that is either going to have a very hard time fitting in with the way that we're working, or realistically somebody I wouldn't be interested in working with. And secondly, I want somebody that's curious. I want people to push back and to challenge each other, because I think one of the biggest things that you guys taught us with the Agile mindset is that no one person's knowledge, experience, and wisdom is better than anybody else's. The idea is that the best solutions generally emerge through conversation, right? Mm-hmm. So bringing together that empirical knowledge is what actually creates the best outcomes, the best solutions, the best craftsmanship possible. So I think I understand what you're saying. Like, if everyone's trying to hire clones of one person just for the sake of homogeny, yeah, that's not interesting. That actually won't get my head off of the pillow in the morning. The idea of having conflicting people that are passionate about the same thing is exciting, because then you actually get to have that differing perspective and such. So when I talk about culture, that's usually what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's far too vague a term, and it's not at all clear in my mind what I mean.
Yeah.
So
I think it's one of those things where we use that word as a container to say we can't put it into a job spec, but we know when we know. And we know but more so, we know when it's not right. If it were a square peg going into a round hole, sometimes there's a little bit too much work to be rounding the pegs.
Yeah, the only thing that I'd say to that is one of my guiding principles is that my brain is not on my side. Your brain is a lazy thing, which makes sense in evolutionary terms, in that just sitting there as you are right now, your brain is about 2% of your body mass, but it's consuming 20% of the energy your body consumes. So our brains are really expensive creatures, and they have evolved to take lots of shortcuts on their way to keeping you alive at least long enough to reproduce. And because of that, I'm very mistrustful because we're so soaked in cognitive biases. I become worried that comfort is something that it's easy to convince yourself is congruent with your intellectual goals, but is just a way for your brain to be saying to you, I don't want to have discussions. I just want to consume my 20% of your caloric intake and take the easy way out. And we're so good at fooling ourselves. So a lot of what I've done in my career is try to find ways to keep myself from fooling myself. I could be fooling myself that I've been successful at that. But I think that a lot of times, and I'm not saying this is you by any means, a lot of times people think they're choosing or organizing for a lofty goal, but actually are slipping into organizing for comfort. And I'm always uncomfortable once I start getting comfortable.
Now I will be questioning everything I do for the rest of my short existence on this giant spinning orb.
Well, good. My job is done.
No, there is something to what you're saying. I mean, I agree. Inherently, as animals, we are very lazy. And we whether we know it or we don't, we do make those cognitive shortcuts within our brain. And then we're rewiring or tricking the system so that as you become aware, as you're made aware of those shortcuts, takes significantly more cognitive effort than it does to leave it be. And it's one of those interesting things. I think it's is it The Power of Habit, I think is the book, and the author's name is escaping me, when they talk about how you actually have to trick your brain to create those artificial or natural rewards so that you can start reversing those mental models. But
yeah, the philosopher and early psychologist William James was a supremely depressive person who I think tried to commit suicide several times. And one day, that's the impression I got from the biography I read a long time ago. He decided, I'm going to be a happy person and I'm going to develop the habit of being happy. And he was successful. He was an early proponent of this habit-based way of doing things. And he spent the rest of his life being a notably jolly fellow.
Nice.
Which is weird.
I need to work on that then. That's my next goal. So we've taken up quite a bit of your time. And I could actually, now that we're entering the realm of neuroscience, I'd love to sit here and continue down the path. But I'm sure you'd outplay me quickly. If our listeners are interested in learning more, you have exemplar.com as your personal web space now. And the Twitter handle is @Marick. Is there any other social channels, any other communication channels that you wish to share with the folks?
Yeah, so there's the blog at exemplar.com is pretty much an archive blog, but for those interested in history and such, there's stuff there. And there are still some essays there that hold up reasonably well over time. I think that some of those are on the sidebar, so people can certainly take a look at that. I am switching my identity to roundingpegs.com, but there's not much there at that site, except there is a blog there, but the blog is much more focused on, oh, you want to do a single page app with Elm and Phoenix? Here's all the stuff you have to wire together, because it took me forever to figure it out. So there's not really, I do keep wanting to write things down. I just gave a talk in Poland about, that was very heavily influenced by two books. One is Seeing Like a State by James C. Scott, and the other is Educating the Reflective Practitioner by a guy named Schoen, which is very striking in that it was written in the early 80s and anticipates really a lot of Agile stuff, the Agile learning style pretty well. And I have lofty goals of like summarizing all that stuff on that blog, but I wouldn't hold my breath. Mostly what I'm doing is writing an Elm Elixir Phoenix app. Okay. So I'm not doing anything of really significant public interest these days.
I would disagree, but as roundingpegs.com becomes more populated, if you want us to be an advocate and share the link with our humble Twitter following and our humble community, we'd be more than happy to.
Okay.
All right, Brian.
You might want to, by the way, the Marick, for people listening, my parents changed the name from Marcinzik to Marick when they immigrated from Germany, not realizing that there's actually already a spelling for Marick, so they just made it up. So Marick at Marick is misspelled. It's Marick rather than the more common Merrick.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Honestly, people will find you much quicker there. We will definitely put links to your Twitter, to your websites in this show description and as we tweet it out. I appreciate your time. This is awesome. Very, very awesome, very informative. And we appreciate everything that you've done for us. It's a shame, it's a shame you're not as active in the Agile community as you once were. I think we all would be getting higher value if you were, but appreciate and respect your position.
Okay.
Thank you.
This episode of the Agile Uprising podcast is brought to you by Lean TV. Lean TV for the Apple TV allows anyone to run and participate in lean coffee-style meetings. This is great for business, brainstorming, family planning, or anything else. Lean TV takes care of the notes, voting, prioritizing, timekeeping, and advancing, all without the need for a meeting facilitator, boards, sticky notes, etc. Hundreds of notes can be written and discarded in an instant. Along with the Apple TV app, there are free companion apps on iOS and Android. No internet connection needed. Visit leantv.io for more info.